All right, guys, good morning. Welcome to week 7. So a little shorter review today. Week 6 is pretty short. Last chapter before we get into, or last chapter before you guys take your midterm. So let's go ahead and talk about your midterm. Hopefully everybody's downloaded the midterm review. Keep in mind your review is due by this Friday. Make sure you email it to the right person. For the review, it's kind of like the notes assignment. We want to see what you guys are learning about or what you've learned and know about each of the terms on the review. I think there's 30 to 40 terms on the review, and those correlate to the multiple choice section of your exam. So if you guys understand all the terms, you should have no problem with the multiple choice section. For the review itself, we don't want to see you just look up definitions of the terms. We want to see that you've looked into the terms, done some research on them, show some historical context, take notes surrounding each of the terms. You don't need to use complete sentences or anything like that. Just bullet points is fine. So some quick bullet points on each of the terms. As long as you cover all the terms, then you'll get 25 points extra credit. So that's a good opportunity if you've missed an assignment or done poorly on a few assignments or want to get ahead on the midterm. That's a quarter of your midterm grade. So that's a pretty big boost if you complete that midterm review. The midterm itself will consist of 30 to 40 multiple choice questions, a few extra credit multiple choice questions to help you out with that section, and then an essay question that you'll have to write an essay on the spot in the field, just like you've been doing in your weekly assignments, that's worth 40% of the overall grade. So 60 points from the multiple choice questions, 40 points from the essay question, and then I'll throw in a few extra credit questions in there to help you guys out. Like I said, do the review. One great benefit of taking online courses is you can use the review while you're actually taking your exam. Another good reason to complete the review before the exam. Of course, you're using the lockdown browser, so you can't use any internet sources or outside sources. You can't use your phones, don't look stuff up. You can use your book and you can use your notes, but it'll be tough to look up stuff in your notes or in your book with the time that's permitted for your exam. So keep in mind, you have an hour and 20 minutes to complete the multiple choice section and the essay portion of your exam. So not enough time, certainly not enough time to look up answers. Make sure you're prepared, make sure you have your review done, and everybody should be good to go. Any questions on the midterm? Okay, great. So your midterm is on Monday. It will open at noon and remain open for 24 hours. You have to take it within that 24-hour time frame. You will have an hour and 20 minutes once you start the midterm. Once you open the lockdown browser and start the midterm, you can't close the lockdown browser. You can't minimize the lockdown browser, or it'll kick you out of the test and your test will be submitted, and that's the grade you'll get. Okay. So make sure you understand how to use the lockdown browser, make sure it's downloaded and functional on your computer. I know there's been a few issues with Google Chromebooks. So especially if you have a Chromebook, they were supposed to patch the issue, but especially if you have a Chromebook, make sure that you download the lockdown browser and make sure it works before you start the exam on Monday. All right, before we move on from midterms, any questions at all?
So we're allowed to use our notes and review.
I can't hear you.
For the exam. I said we're allowed to use our notes and review worksheet for the exam.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, you can use your
Okay.
notes, you can use your review. You know, your notes, you're going to have a lot of notes throughout the semester. So I recommend just doing a really solid review and using your review for the exam.
And then for the lockdown browser, I know like for some of my classes, it asked me like to show my surroundings.
Yeah, that's
Do I
the
have to show you
webcam
like the
feature.
notes?
No, we won't be using the webcam feature. I have, like 700 students, so I can't watch 700 hours of people taking midterm exams. So yeah, just the
Okay.
lockdown browser. Also goes without saying, but anyone caught plagiarizing or cheating gets an automatic 0 on the exam. Pretty hard to pass the class if you get a 0 on your midterm. So of course, don't try to cheat, don't plagiarize, blah, blah, blah. All right. All right, guys, so pretty short chapter this week. Last chapter before the midterm. Also, your chapter assignment is a little bit easier this week than most weeks. There's no short answer questions, no essay questions, just multiple choice and true false. And that's because I wanted you to also focus on your midterm review. Make sure you guys are thinking about the midterm reviews and working on that and focusing on your midterm, which is such a big grade coming up on Monday. All right, so this week we're dealing with the repercussions of the revolution. We go through this process of individual states establishing their own state constitutions, which allows an opportunity for a lot of these revolutionary thinkers and forefathers, prominent members of the revolution, to discuss and come up with to discuss and argue for their vision of what American democracy will look like, what American liberty and how American liberty is defined after the revolution's impact on things like slavery and labor and indentured servitude, things like religious tolerance, the relationship between church and state, how the legislature will be established in terms of representing the people, the functions of the federal government, the functions of state governments, the powers of federal governments versus the powers of state governments, et cetera, et cetera. So this is all really leading up to the big debate over the ratification of the Constitution and the function of the federal government in the newly formed United States. So make sure you guys understand the different approaches to state constitutions. It focuses a lot on the Pennsylvania state constitution. Pennsylvania is used as a example of sort of a more radical approach to their state constitutions, challenging the authority of the aristocracy, challenging the relationship between church and state. We know Pennsylvania is where a lot of these radicals or revolutionary thinkers came from. Most significantly was Thomas Paine, which we've talked about prior to the revolution. You'll read about this dichotomy between Paine and Adams as they're sort of arguing two positions on what the legislature should look like, what Congress should look like in representing the American people. Make sure you understand the difference between Paine's idea of representation and John Adams' idea of representation. Property qualifications, expansions of democracy is another important topic of Chapter 6. We'll see that in these state constitutions, we see a great expansion of democracy, where property qualifications are lower and lower to participate, or depending on the state, are lowered to allow more white landowning males basically to participate in the democratic process. All of these processes create what are known as republics. Make sure you understand the basic concept of a republic, which is basically this notion that political authority rests in the hands of people who are authorizing representatives, right? So political authority rests in the consent of those who are being governed. People give consent for people to represent them in a democratic system. That's basically a republic. We also start to see a major split between regions in the country. Every state north of Maryland takes some effort or makes some effort or takes some steps towards emancipation or some form of abolishing slavery. Make sure you understand that process. This is usually about the lineage of slaves, or usually about inheriting slaves, or the status of a African American born to slave parents or free parents. It isn't a direct emancipation or a direct abolishment of slavery, but it's sort of a tiered system where slaves are eventually granted their freedom, whether that be through slaves' children or specific indentured servitude terms. Read about Pennsylvania forced their slaves to work for certain indentured terms before releasing them. So yeah, make sure you understand the difference between Adams and Paine. Adams sort of supports the social stratification, believes in a higher house and a lower house, whereas Paine believes that the representatives should represent all Americans. There shouldn't be an upper class, which is the House of Lords in England, and a lower class, the House of Commons. He believes representatives should reflect all members of a certain society. This really goes back to a notion of what the revolution really was. We'll talk about this again in chapter 7. But this idea, was the revolution really a social revolution to improve conditions for the working class? Or was it a revolution of independence to retain power among the social elites, the sort of aristocracy in the country? John Adams really believes in maintaining these social hierarchies, whereas Thomas Paine believes that this was a social revolution to give liberties, extend liberties to all Americans. You'll read a lot about religious tolerance, the process of religious tolerance. Prior to the revolution, outside of some sort of radical colonies, Pennsylvania we talked about, and their sort of unique religious dynamics. Rhode Island has some very unique religious dynamics after it's established by sort of excommunicated Puritans. We add to that the impact of Catholics on the American Revolution, the invasion of Quebec, using the French as allies after the Battle of Saratoga. And so this all sort of loosens this anti-Catholic American sentiments. And we really start to see a breakdown of this strict division between Protestant America and Catholic Canada or Catholic Maryland. We start to see a breakdown of this very staunch anti-Catholicism that supported this notion that English colonies were staunchly Protestant. This goes back to the Catholic-Protestant rivalries that are taking place in Europe. So we start to see those break down. We start to see less definitions of American identity being tied to Protestantism, but more tied to religious tolerance or religious diversity. This is also tied to the Enlightenment. Make sure you understand those relationships. Then they get into economic freedom. This is an interesting section, and they really focus on Virginia in this section. They talk about Thomas Jefferson trying to prevent a future aristocracy dominating conditions in Virginia, which is sort of ironic because he's part of that aristocracy. They talk about inflation after the revolution and how that sparked boycotts and movements against creditors and banks and against stores that were charging exorbitant prices. So make sure you understand the causes of inflation and American responses to these inflations. And this really goes down to a fundamental argument over the government's role in regulating an economy, right? This is the first time we start to see these two sides of the argument rise, where one side believes that the interests of the community should take precedence over the property rights of individuals. And so the government should be involved in regulating the economy for the interests of the community at whole, rather than the government staying out of economic affairs, which is the other side of the coin, where they argue that the government should support sort of laissez-faire policies, let the market regulate itself. These individuals believe that the market will sort of produce its own social harmony, that the market will regulate itself, and that it doesn't need any government intervention. These two positions will continue to be sticking points in national politics for the next 250 years, still are today. The government's role in regulating the economy, or the government staying out of the economy and letting the market regulate itself. Make sure you guys understand the negative impact that the revolution had on Native Americans. Both Native Americans that sided with the British, but also Native Americans in the old Northwest Territory. Remember, prior to the revolution, the king issued the proclamation line, trying to dissuade American settlers from moving into the old Northwest Territory. But we see rapidly after the revolution, American colonists believed that one of the benefits of winning the revolution was unfettered access to Native American lands, unfettered access to territories across the country. So this has a profound impact on these dynamics between not only Americans now, American citizens now, and Native Americans, but also the role the government should play in removing Native Americans and facilitating the process of manifest destiny, moving white societies further and further west for white agricultural and economic interests. So we start to see the government become more actively involved in some of these processes of protecting Americans in this manifest destiny move. All right. Sort of a tragic story, talking about the 5 Iroquois nations. You'll read about that. Their alliances with Great Britain turned out to be very detrimental to their societies. So we start to see a major shift where the agency and freedom of Native Americans precipitously declines as the agency and growth of Anglo communities and American colonies begin, or American states begin to increase. All right, also make sure you guys read about the impact on slavery and labor. This is a big section of the chapter. We really start to see by the turn of the 19th century, 1800, that indentured servitude has all but come to an end. We see a major division between economic systems in the North and in the South, whereas northern states above Maryland, after the turn of the 19th century, begin the process of abolishing slavery, shifting economic systems to what will be more what we call the market revolution or industrial revolution, new industries and manufacturing and so forth. At the same time, the South is writing laws to further entrench and protect the institution of slavery, as their economies become increasingly reliant on slavery as a central process to their economy, right? They are slave societies by the turn of the 19th century. So we really start to see this division after the revolution as these states write their constitution and define the role slavery will play in their economies and their societies. The North begins the process of abolishing slavery and shifting their economies to industry, whereas the South starts the process of protecting the institution of slavery from federal intervention and instilling slavery as more and more crucial to the economic and social processes in the South. You'll learn about some really interesting freedom petitions at the end of the chapter. As the rhetoric of the revolution starts to permeate American society, Many of these marginalized groups start to use the rhetoric of the revolution against the authors of that rhetoric. They begin to say, well, if liberty is a universal entitlement, like Thomas Jefferson tried to define in the Declaration of Independence, then why isn't that liberty extended to African Americans or slaves or women or Native Americans, etc., immigrants, etc.? So we'll see that they start to use that rhetoric of unalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, these new definitions of American liberty against the system. One very important individual in that process is a man named Lemuel Hayes. Lemuel Hayes was a Black minister in free Black communities, and actually preached to white congregations, had this sort of influence in white communities and Black communities, tried to use his influence to petition courts to sort of set precedences about their definition of liberty, wanted to extend these concepts of freedom and liberty to African Americans and former slaves, tried to petition court systems and actually influence politicians to pass legislation that would benefit slaves. And out of this, you have in the North the first advent of these large, significant free Black communities, where we see significant cultural developments in African American culture, and also limited agency and impact in social systems and local politics and education and et cetera, religion and community leadership, things like that. So yeah, that's sort of a brief recap of the chapter. Like I said, the quiz is a little shorter this week. This is really more of a precursor to the bigger discussions about ratifying the Constitution that we'll go over next week. But make sure you guys understand all the terms that come from Chapter 6, because you will be tested in your midterm exam. Chapter 6 is included. So, you guys have any questions for me? Anything about the exam or the chapter or any issues going on? Now's your chance, guys. I'm a good resource.
Hi, how are you doing, sir? Just wanted to ask on grades. There's still stuff that's like from week 3 and week 4 and 5 that's graded. Is that normal?
I can barely hear you, Diego.
Sorry, let me raise that. Sorry, is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Sorry. I wanted to ask about grades. Is it normal still not to get grades back from week 4, week 3?
Yeah, grades will be uploaded as they're completed. That's all I can tell you.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because your post on Monday was saying about how people couldn't read your feedback, and I would
Right.
I only have one so far.
You only have one what?
Grade with feedback.
Actually, Diego, I looked at your grades this morning, and everything is graded except 4 assignments.
Yes, sir.
So what do you mean you only have one?
I only have week 3, chapter 2 with the comment on it.
Okay, let me look at your assignments here. Okay, here's your week 2 assignment. Week 2 secondary source assignment has several comments. Make sure you check those out. Your week 2 chapter 1 assignment has...
Okay, so we have to open up the assignment and then click on the actual calculated grade in order to get to your feedback. Is correct?
I believe so. I'm not on that end of it, so I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, your week 2 chapter 1 assignment also has several comments on it.
I was waiting.
Your week 3 chapter 2 assignment has several comments you need to look at. So yeah, there's comments on every one of yours. Make sure you go back through and check those out.
Okay, because common to me means that there's a little bubble next to the grade, and the only one that had that was week 3. So I didn't know that you had to click on the assignment.
If you want to hang out, I can share my screen, and I don't want to show everybody your grades and your comments.
No, sir, I figured it out. You just have to open up and then click on the calculated grade.
I don't know if it's my computer, Diego, but I can barely hear you.
Okay. I'm gonna raise it.
Why don't you hang out, Diego, and we'll talk after the session.
Okay.
Great, thanks. What else, guys? Anything else? Your midterm's coming up on Monday. Seems like a good opportunity to ask me some questions about the review. All right, well, I tried. Maybe for your final review, you guys will prepare some questions because I know the guy that writes the test, so I'm a really good resource. The guy is me that writes the test. That was a cheesy joke. All right, guys, well, have a good day. Good luck on your midterm. We'll see you guys next week. Shoot me an email if you need any help with anything or you have any questions. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too. Just so everybody sees.
Yes, sir.
Okay, cool. All right, guys, Diego's going to go over how to view individual comments on each assignment.
Okay. If you could disable the share screen so I can share my screen with you, sir.
Okay, do you have it?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Okay. So I'll go with this one. Okay. So see, like on week 3, there is a comment bubble, and on the comment bubble, that's where this would show up. And
So
this
that's the
isn't
main comment.
This is the main comment. This isn't the
Okay.
feedback. So in order to see the feedback, we have to click on the actual assignment and then click on the calculated grade. Clicking on the calculated grade shows your response. But what I don't see is my response. So I can't see the feedback on what I
You can't see your answer.
Correct. So if there was any way from your side, if we could still see our answers, that would be great as well.
Yeah.
Just so that we can, because I mean, I read it and I was like, okay, but what did I write?
Yeah, right. You can't remember from 3 weeks ago. Okay.
Right.
Huh.
Yes, sir. And that's why I hadn't checked any of the other ones because I had never seen anything with this comment bubble. But if we do go back to, like you said, week 2, there is stuff in there that you had already responded. But it doesn't give us
Okay.
any indication that there is some feedback on it.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying that for me.
No, sir, I figured it out just as soon as you said that there was comments and things like that.
Okay. Thanks for looking into that for me. I'll have to, I wonder if it's a setting on my end, show original answer or something like that. I'll dig in and look through a bunch of the settings on my end. But yeah, that doesn't really help if you don't remember exactly what you wrote for that response, right?
Right.
Okay, well, let me look into that then. Do you want to go over some of your individual responses? Here, let me stop recording.